Good morning, afternoon. Okay, good evening. My name is Sandy Fritz. I'm the chairperson of the Shrewsbury School Committee, and welcome to our meeting of January 6th. Due to the inability of the Shrewsbury Media Connection staff to support a broadcast from Town Hall this evening, we are meeting remotely. Our meeting is broadcast live on Selco channels 29 and 329, and it also is streamed live on Shrewsbury Media Connection's website. I would like to thank Shrewsbury Media Connection Executive Director Mark Serra, as well as Shrewsbury Public Schools IT Director Brian LaRue, who help with our meetings each night. I would also like to say that first on our agenda is public participation. No one has asked to address the committee this evening, but if anybody would like to do so in the future, you can, I'm mumbling this evening, you can contact us at school committee at Shrewsbury at, excuse me, at school committee at shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. We're rusty getting back to this new school year. Next on the agenda is chairperson and members report. Does anyone have anything this evening? And I am not seeing anything on the screen. Great, thank you. Next is superintendent's report.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. Unfortunately, today's date will go down as a very dark day in the history of our country. As I believe all of us should be, I am profoundly disturbed by what has occurred in our nation's capital. And I urge everyone to reflect on what today's events could portend for America if we as a people do not counter this anti-democratic behavior by reaffirming the values and principles on which our government was founded, especially for our children. Our district's mission states that we will provide our students with, quote, an appreciation of our democratic tradition. This crisis of democracy signals to me that we must redouble our efforts to ensure that our children develop the ability to resist demagoguery and a mob mentality, and to discern what is right and just, and then take action to promote and defend this democratic tradition that we all must cherish. Those are my comments for superintendent's report this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. First on the agenda this evening will be an update on the school reopening. I'll turn it back to Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz, and I'll share my screen in a moment. You bear with me. Okay, if you give me the thumbs up that you can see that on your screen. Okay. So again, thank you for tuning in, those who are watching, or if you're watching on recording. Want to start again, as we always do, with our key messages, that this year the health and well-being of our students, families, and staff is our first priority, that our focus this school year is to develop a safe school environment for our students and our staff that prioritizes everyone's well-being and enables high levels of learning for all, and that we're operating based on guidance from public health authorities, the Mass Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and closely monitoring the latest information from medical experts and evolving data regarding the pandemic, both in the state and here in our own community. Our most recent data this week, our calendar week beginning Sunday, we've had 23 cases identified of people who attend our hybrid model. For those who are not aware, we are not having in-person school this week. We made that decision in December prior to the December vacation in order to guard against an expected surge in cases based on the holidays. I'm happy that we have not seen a major surge, but we have seen a continuation of a high case number that we've seen essentially since mid-November. We've had 224 cases since the start of school, and we've had 3 cases traced to possible exposure in school, and we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. In our remote program, we've had 1 case this week, and we've had 12 total cases of our students who do not attend school in person at all and opted to do a totally remote program. We publish our dashboard every Monday. You can see this is the last 4 weeks of case numbers. We had a trend moving downwards a bit and then ticked back up last week. And right now we're on a trend for the week so far that will probably hit that number or a bit higher. That will depend on the number of cases that emerge Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. This is a slide we've been sharing all along, which shows the Johns Hopkins data on positivity rate by state. Relative to the rest of the country, you can see Massachusetts remains relatively low. However, it's ticked up 3 percentage points above the 5% baseline that Johns Hopkins and the World Health Organization indicate is a place where communities should look to whether or not there may be a concern of community spread. So that's a number that we're not happy has been ticking up, although you'll see in a bit that the number in Shrewsbury has been coming down a little bit. Well, it remains to be seen what it looks like for this post-holiday season. This is the benchmark for Shrewsbury. As of the last published report on December 31st, the positivity rate was 6.83% for Shrewsbury. It had moved up into the 7% range and then back down to 6.83%. Hopefully that trend will continue, but that remains to be seen. As far as the case counts, this most recent week reported, or 2-week period that the state reported on was the 13th through the 26th, where there were 304 cases in Shrewsbury, which was a 55 per 100,000 over 14 days. Again, in the red zone. It was a reduction compared to the previous period, which had 362 cases and was at a 65.5 rate per 100,000. As we've shared in the past, we've been looking at a variety of medical literature and expertise in terms of risk of in-school transmission. All of the mitigation strategies that are recommended are things that we implement within our schools. Because of the increased caseload in the community, obviously the risk has increased to some degree, but fortunately we have seen, continue to see over time that the risk of in-school transmission has been very low as a result of the mitigation factors we put in place. There is updated state guidance that came out in November, obviously to look at transmission in schools, and that's the key thing to look for. And that guidance also indicates that when communities are in the red, the guidance is to have a hybrid learning program. Again, we moved away from that this week as a precaution, and that's something we'll be considering in terms of returning. The expectation and the plan is to return to hybrid learning next Monday. We are going to be looking at cases over the course of the rest of the next couple of days. We'll speak to that a little bit further in the presentation as well. It is one of the key things we've been trying to do is maintain stability for the program we do have. Our current program does really minimize close contacts because of the 6-foot distancing we use. And we've avoided lots of quarantining as a result. There have been districts in our state and elsewhere who've had to move to full remote because they haven't been able to adequately staff their schools because of the number of staff who needed to be quarantined due to close contact if they're using less than a 6-foot guideline. And then we continue to follow guidance from public health and medical experts because of course the current case count is of concern, especially in the community. We have had some cases of suspected in-school transmission. We've had 3 suspected cases now. They were in December. Each of those cases was between 2 individuals. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Noelle Freeman, who can talk a little bit more about this specifically and give some perspective as to the steps we took as a result.
Thanks, Dr. Sawyer. If you can advance to the next slide. As Dr. Sawyer has shared, over time, we have seen an increase in positive cases over this last month as compared with September and October. As of today, we have 236 positive cases of COVID in the school community. That does include the 12 cases in individuals who are in our fully remote cohort. It's clear that the predictions that were made by experts about the effect that holidays would have on the spread of the virus were unfortunately correct. 80% of our cases have occurred since November 27th, which is right after Thanksgiving. We've averaged about 30 cases per week, as Dr. Sawyer said, since Thanksgiving. Of course, we are hopeful that the numbers will level out again as we move further out from the holidays. The next number on the slide is the number of school-related close contacts that have been identified. I have spoken in detail in the past about contact tracing, so I won't get into detail about that tonight. Contact tracing is done when cases occur, but to be clear, in-school contact tracing has not been necessary in all of the 236 cases. When the positive individual has not been in school for the 2 days prior to developing symptoms or testing positive, whichever of those happens first, contact tracing is done by the Department of Public Health for contacts outside of school, but it's not needed in school because the person wasn't in school during what is considered their infectious period. So based on that public health standard, only about a third of our cases have required contact tracing. And those that have required tracing have identified 147 potential close contacts. And just as a reminder, the definition of close contacts is someone being within 6 feet of the positive individual for 15 minutes or more. When looking at this, we do need to err on the side of caution. Whenever there's a question about that amount of time or how close someone was, and in instances when we're unable to fully trace a situation. An example of that is in athletics, when we have an individual on a team who tests positive and they played in a game or attended a full practice during their 2-day tracing period. It's really not possible for us to look at the game or the practice and total up the contact that occurred between players and coaches. So the recommendation of public health is that the entire team needs to be considered close contacts. This did happen in 2 occasions during winter athletics. And as you can see on the slide, 47 of the 147 close contacts are actually due to those team situations that required contact tracing and subsequent quarantine of those team members and coaches. I do want to say that this is different from most of our cases where we need to contact trace. For the most part, we find between 0 and 2 close contacts on average. And this really speaks to the diligence that our students and staff are using, the mitigation strategies that we have in place, specifically 6-foot distancing, which minimizes close contact while they're in school. I do want to mention just a little bit more about those 3 cases that Dr. Sawyer referenced, in which our contact tracing uncovered possible in-school transmission of the virus. In all of our cases, we look back at possible crossover with previous cases, and we consult with Central Mass Regional Public Health Alliance if we have questions about cases that have occurred within the same classroom or other areas like the bus or athletics, et cetera, within a 2-week period. They help us to determine if in-school transmission should be considered. And in these 3 particular instances, the suspicion was high enough that our conversation with our Central Mass colleagues was coupled with a consult with epidemiologists at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And it is those epidemiologists who, based on their assessment, approve or not the use of the mobile testing unit that can be sent out. So that unit was deployed in 2 of the circumstances where we had concern for in-school transmission. In total, over 60 people were tested from those 2 cases, and no additional positives were found, which is very reassuring that the transmission, if it did occur, was isolated to 2 individuals in each case. I will say that in the 3rd situation, where we suspect in-school transmission, the group of people involved was too small to warrant the testing unit coming out. But we did recommend that all of those, the small group of people be tested on their own, and those people have also tested negative, so there was no further spread. I also want to stress again that the determination of possible in-school transmission is not made by us. It is made by our public health partners. And I will also mention that we have brought other situations to them for review when we've had some level of concern about crossover, and their determination was that in-school exposure or transmission was not a concern. And we didn't move forward for that reason. finally, I would just like to revisit this slide, which was part of the staff and family trainings that we shared in August when we were first returning to in-person learning. Feels like a long time ago. And I know that people are tired of the situation that we're in and tired of all the mitigation strategies that we need to think about when interacting with each other every day. However, we do need to remain vigilant, especially now with our school and community numbers higher than they were back in the summer and the fall. One thing that the district numbers are showing is that what we are doing for mitigation in our buildings is working to keep in-school transmission to a minimum. So we need to remind everyone once again to please continue to follow these strategies: masking, avoiding being within 6 feet of others whenever possible, washing or sanitizing hands frequently, and staying home if you're sick, remembering that attention to common symptoms like headache, cold symptoms, GI symptoms, cough, etc., is important, because there is no one hallmark symptom to let you know that what you're dealing with is COVID. All of this really does apply not only when we are at school, but when we are at home and interacting with friends and family. We are seeing clusters of cases that are resulting from friends gathering. And while we know that it's really difficult to stay apart for as long as we've needed to, and especially difficult for our high school kids, we do remind you that gathering needs to be done with safety in mind. And I'll just close by saying that I do believe that there is light at the end of this very long tunnel. It's encouraging to hear plans coming together for vaccine distribution, but in order to get to the end of this, we need to continue to be vigilant and work together. And I sincerely thank everyone for the courage, collaboration, and commitment it has taken to get us this far. And now I'll pass it back to Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. And I certainly underscore all those things that she indicated that will help us to try to keep this from spreading further. As far as the decision-making regarding a return to hybrid, which is the plan for Monday at this point, the default plan, we continue to review the case numbers for this week. As I mentioned earlier, they're trending slightly higher than previous weeks, but we've not seen a large spike post-Christmas and post-New Year's at this point. I do expect to make a decision by midday Friday to communicate what the status will be for Monday. We are continuing to consult with our medical experts and public health authorities on this decision. As we just mentioned, we've had a very small percentage of suspected in-school transmission. Those have been isolated cases, and the testing we were able to access through the state showed that there were no clusters, and the nature of those contacts actually may have played a role in those isolated cases. So it's not the typical situation we would see normally in most of our classrooms and schools. The guidelines that DESE has is for us to employ the hybrid model and prioritize our high need students when the community is in red status. We have been following guidance all along, other than this week, which we took as a precautionary approach, which I think was a wise thing to do. And so we will continue to monitor closely. We'll let people know by Friday what the decision is for Monday. And the last piece I want to mention is that we are also exploring pool testing for COVID as a surveillance tool. COVID-19 testing has not been something that we have been able to employ to this point, essentially due to a lack of funds, how much an investment we'd have to make in order to get the adequate frequency and volume to make it a true surveillance program like you might be familiar with some of our colleges, for example. However, with some new and then the ability to continue some federal stimulus funding based on the new law that was recently passed for COVID-19 related costs may provide us an opportunity to do this. Mr. Collins and Ms. Freeman have met with multiple vendors to learn what different options that we have. And if we do pursue this kind of pool testing, which I'll ask Ms. Freeman to kind of explain briefly what that means, we'll likely begin with staff and phase it in to some level. Some districts that have begun doing this are doing it with staff, and sometimes just high school students, sometimes high school and middle school students. Again, we'd have to look at what's affordable and doable, as well as, especially with the logistics, but it could be a very useful tool to help us maintain in-person school while awaiting the advent of the vaccine. But Ms. Freeman, can you just briefly describe what pool testing involves and how that works?
Sure. So I think most people are familiar with individual testing, where each person goes and gives their sample, whether it be saliva or a nasal swab, are the most common tests being used right now, to my knowledge. And you get your test result back for your sample. For pooled testing, each person does their either saliva test or nasal swab. We've talked to vendors who use both options, and then a group of between 10 and 25 individual samples are grouped together and tested as one test. So those 10 to 25 people's sample gets mixed and tested. If everyone in that pool tests negative, if that pool comes back as negative, it tells you that all of those people are negative. If the pool comes back as positive, then they would go back and test the individual samples to determine which person in that pool is the positive individual, or if there could be more than one. The advantage to pool testing is the cost savings related to it. Obviously, if they're just running one test for 10 to 25 people, it's much more cost effective than running the individual tests for all of those people. And then we would be paying for an additional fee if they do need to go back and test individuals, but they're finding that for the most part, pools are testing negative, and there's a big savings there, and you're still getting the information that you need.
Thank you very much for explaining that. So it's something we're looking into. We think it could be a useful tool, and want to be sure that the school committee is aware of that and comfortable that we're pursuing that option. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Clowder, who's going to give a brief update relative to a new mandate from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Clowder.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. My presentation tonight is really a brief update about the new student learning time regulations from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Although I'm happy to field some questions at the end, I imagine we'll have more time for details once we have confirmed what our response to the mandate will be. We're still working on the details of that. These are unusual times made more difficult by outside stressors, including concerns about the pandemic, isolation and mental health, and growing awareness about how issues of race and equity are impacting our school communities. Overall, I remain impressed by the commitment our educators have made to ensure that our classrooms remain safe and productive places. And this commitment was first demonstrated when we began developing our initial implementation plan in August. Over the summer, teacher teams at every level articulated what we'd learned from the closure of schools in the spring, as well as what they felt was most important to include in our hybrid schedules as we grappled with this next normal. And I think it's helpful to remind the public about the factors that drove our initial planning, which were making sure our students were safe, smart, healthy, and that they stayed well. So what that means in terms of our key considerations are that we were deliberate in wanting a hybrid model that utilized Shrewsbury educators whenever feasible. We also felt it was important to provide every child with live instruction every week. And so as a consequence, we had challenges to address on remote days, namely how to provide continuity of instruction and connectivity for kids. Schedules were built around the notion that we wanted to check in with students every day, particularly our youngest students. And at the same time, we anticipated that we would have constraints because we had Shrewsbury educators teaching our students in person. On the remote days, those same teachers were not available for remote students. So how would we think about appropriate ways to engage students in various places and ways at the same time? And we grappled with how to deliver high quality instruction consistently. We formed teacher teams who together developed videos and lessons to engage students in content that would be appropriate for whole groups. We purchased platforms and assembled kind of what I need bags of hands-on materials to allow for individualized practice across content areas. And we used assessment data to identify and support students that need extra help. But in our initial plan, not all students received the same amount of live support by design, because we were hoping to really be able to emphasize the importance of targeted instruction. Record numbers of students seeking mental health help at hospitals across the Commonwealth raised concern about student well-being at the state level. And so, taken together with a stated desire to kind of establish a baseline for districts, DESE was prompted to consider new guidelines. And the commissioner presented those guidelines to the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, asking them to improve them on an emergency basis at its last monthly meeting. And they passed by a vote of 7-4, which essentially moves the goalpost for us in terms of our initial planning about live instruction. So we must all comply with the new DESE requirements for minimum live time that students experience over a 10-day period. And to recap, live time is synchronous time that can either be delivered in person or live via Zoom. So in early November, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education collected student learning time data from districts all across the state. And DESE used this data to come up with a new mandate on the minimum amount of live learning time students must experience. So you can see that in a hybrid model, the district average of live time across the grades should be 35 hours over a 10-day period. In a remote model, a district average has to be 40 hours of live time over a 10-day period. And districts are responsible for making sure that there's a daily live check-in for all students in grades K-12. So optional office hours will not count towards this requirement because they need to be something that's provided to all students. The students in grades K-8 already get this through morning meeting and homeroom, but we'll need to provide this to all high school students every day, and that's currently not part of our scheduling. So many districts like us will need to make adjustments for the learning model that we've implemented, and that has to be done by January 19th. To start, we'll need to comply with the minimum of 35 hours of live instruction for students learning in the hybrid model. However, it's worth noting that if we switch to learning in a fully remote model, the district would have to immediately meet the 40-hour standard for live time required. And the expectation from DESE is that we'd be able to do this fluidly as soon as the model changes. And so for that reason, district leaders have begun the work of analyzing our current schedules at all levels and talking with teacher teams and engaging the SEA and the SPA to come up with really good ideas for how to address this. The next data collection point is likely to be in early February, but it's not clear at this point what the process will look like. And as I mentioned in previous presentations, our goal will be to hold on to what's working. We have good feedback from students and families about the plans that we've had in place. And at the same time, confronting the reality that more live time is a good thing. We just have to make sure that we put it in on the right places. We want to engage students in a full learning day, but this doesn't mean that we want all students to be online for the whole school day. We want students to have access to live teaching, but that doesn't mean we want teachers talking on camera for the entire teaching day. And across levels, we recognize that what works for some will not work for all, so solutions might vary by grade span. Our goal is to continue to work with teacher teams, curriculum teams, and district leaders, and to collaborate with the SEA and the SPA to identify solutions that improve teaching and learning for students and staff. Again, our goal has always been to assure students remain connected and engaged, and we've continuously strived to focus on the things that we should: fostering wonder, sustaining individual growth, supporting the creation of high-quality student work, and helping our students to meet with success, both academically and socially. Thank you.
So thank you to Ms. Clowder, and obviously we'll update the committee once we've come up with what our solution will be to tweak our program in the places we need to meet the new mandate from the state. So in conclusion, we certainly want to continue to maintain hope for better times ahead, but also view our current situation with candor. Things will eventually get better. We know we'll be returning to a more normal situation at some time in the future, hopefully not too distant future, but we are responsible for analyzing our current circumstances and continuing to make decisions based on that balanced view of risk we try to take all along. Obviously, the safety relative to the coronavirus. Also the issues relative to making sure we're providing our students with the resources and educational opportunities and emotional and support that they need during this difficult, trying time. With that, I would be happy to take any questions or comments the committee has.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer and staff, for providing that information tonight. And if the committee has any questions or comments on any of the information, Mr. Palish.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a question for Dr. Sawyer or your team. You alluded to the new stimulus package, which I know there was quite a bit of press coverage around some funding it may have contained for public education. I'm just wondering if you can comment on what our understanding is at this point of how significant that might be, what that might cover. I would assume it will be restricted explicitly to COVID-related expenditures, but I'm just wondering if you can walk us through what we know at this point.
Sure, and I'll ask Mr. Collins to help with any information. We have not received specific details yet from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. However, initial indications are that it is essentially the same type of funding that came in the first stimulus package, the CARES Act. We received about $160,000 some odd dollars from that directly. That was restricted for use on COVID-related costs. We've been indicated that the amount of funding in the new stimulus law is about 4 times that amount. So, somewhere over $600,000 we're hopeful will be coming our way directly to the school district for use on COVID-related pieces, which is why we're exploring that possibility of you doing some pool surveillance testing with some of those funds. Additionally, there's some funding that the municipality, the town of Shrewsbury, has that would have expired at the end of the calendar year, but was extended by a year with the new law as well. And we've been fortunate that Mr. Mizikar has been willing to work with us on spending some of those funds in support of the schools in different ways, certainly through the Public Buildings Department and supporting all the various enhanced cleaning that we need to do, but also for some direct costs that the school departments incurred that were related to COVID as well. Mr. Collins might have something to add in addition to that.
Yeah, I really don't have any other, relevant information other than, the figures that were just noted are our own estimates. There's been no information yet, as Dr. Sawyer mentioned, published by the Department of Education about what the school district allocations will be. The estimate that was provided is really just based upon kind of a past pattern, in that we're hopeful that maybe by next week that we would get confirmation about what the amount would be for this next round of stimulus funding and what the authorized uses would be as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Lindsay.
I want to thank you for the presentation. My question really revolves around some of the COVID testing that you mentioned and the screening. And certainly as a committee, we've discussed this many times and would prefer that we had more robust screening possibilities open to us to really understand what's happening in our communities. But as the numbers are on the rise, I think many parents and educators would like to learn a little bit more about that. Can you say, and I may have missed it, so apologies, what kind of timeline we have on potential decision-making for that and what might be a potential implementation? I would just say I really do strongly support your, what I understand is your thinking that we begin with our educators. They are certainly in a higher risk category on a bunch of different levels than many of our children, but supporting our staff such that they can come to work as essential workers is the right choice. And we roll out to students as we can. But what's a timeline on that people might learn, even a decision-making timeline, if not an implementation one?
Sure. Well, some of it is tied to confirming about the funding that we, as Mr. Collins just mentioned, we're hoping to get some information by next week. We also, and hopefully in that case, if we could make a determination shortly thereafter, within a week plus, and engage with the vendor. In our sense, I believe Mr. Collins has indicated is that would probably need at least upwards of 3 weeks just for the logistics to get the company on board and doing the work. So I'd say probably a month out is a reasonable estimate if we're able to move quickly and get the information we need quickly. probably a month to 6 weeks if the information on funding is delayed.
Okay, anyone else? Not seeing it. And I too want to thank you for looking into the pool testing. I think it's something that we have heard from educators as well as parents. It's something that will help with some certainty around what is happening within the schools. We are feeling that in-school transmission is not, it's not happening. We're feeling it's a more safe environment. So that testing is going to help with that data. So thank you for pushing that and looking for the funding to get that done. Okay, anything else? I'm not seeing it. John has lost his video. He sent me a text. So if Mr. Wensky has anything, John, just speak up. Fun with remote meetings again.
Yeah, I'm good. No, thanks. I'm still working on technical issues.
Okay, thanks. All right, not seeing anything else on this. We'll move along. Okay, next on the agenda, we are going to have another update on our elementary redistricting project. At our meeting on December 16th, we did have an update from our regarding the geographic information from our consulting team. And tonight we're going to have a presentation, a summary of the redistricting options that the consulting team has created based on the guiding principles and feedback from our redistricting committee. The redistricting committee will be further providing a review of these options, and they will make a recommendation to the school committee of their preferred option at our January 20th meeting. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Collins, and we will have a pretty detailed recommendation of these options tonight. And then we will have a couple of other meetings. And then at the January 20th meeting, we will have that option presented to us. So turn it over to Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mrs. Fritz. And just for those who might be watching this either this evening, likely not, but later on rebroadcast, if you haven't seen previous meetings, this elementary school redistricting project actually officially began back in January with our first meeting. We met intermittently for a while, stopped after COVID hit us, and then picked it back up in the fall, meeting on a more regular basis. And at your last meeting, as you mentioned, the school committee received not only information from a demographic expert on enrollment projections, but also an update around the process, how this process works in the associated timeline. And we're very pleased to have hired AppGeo as our consulting vendor. And both Kate Hickey, who's the principal in charge and vice president, is on the call with us this evening, as is Priya Kansalia, the project manager, and she's going to go into a PowerPoint presentation in just a moment. But before that, I just want to make sure that the community at large knows the committee members, in addition to both Mrs. Fritz and Mr. Wensky, Dr. Sawyer, myself. We have principal representatives, Brian Mabey from Spring Street, Tiffany Ostrander from Coolidge, parent representatives Sharon Creedon from Patton School, Christine Jasinski from Coolidge, Rajesh Velagapudi from Floral, Tarek Andy from Beale, and Sanam Zaire from Spring Street School. So all of those folks are on the call this evening to also respond at the end of the presentation to questions or contribute to the discussion this evening. It is a lot of information. And again, just another community note that we have lots of information about prior presentations, schedules, timelines. All of that is on our school district website under the Beale Project. And community members are welcome to provide feedback to us, the redistricting committee, through an email address that's noted on there called redistricting@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. So I think one of the outcomes of this evening would be certainly that the school committee has a greater understanding of some of the options. We've looked at many. I think it's upward of 15 different options, and you'll see 5 tonight that have risen to the forefront that we think best match with all of the guiding principles and context. And we're looking actually for, certainly having the school committee understand what those options are, but also any kind of guidance or feedback that you might have to help guide the redistricting committee as we continue towards the finish line here of our work. And with that, I would turn it over to Priya, who's going to share her screen and run us through a slide deck here.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Pat. I'm just going to share my screen here. I just hope I have the right. Do you see?
Yep, if you could just make it larger or largest that you could.
Do you see it now, the presentation?
Yes.
We're seeing the next slide as well. Priya, I don't know if you can change the presentation mode.
I think because what it's doing is it's, let's see if I can, yeah, this is what I want to share. Okay, that's right. Do you see this? You see the slide now? Yeah, perfect. So good evening, everybody. Pat made the introduction of our process, which was presented in the previous presentation that we did. It is a pretty detailed process of several steps of creating components and evaluating them, and then building scenarios, looking at a lot of different data sets. But today what we're going to present to you is the scenarios which we have actually developed. We'll start off by looking at the current current distribution of students and the projections, give you a little bit of an overview of the scenarios, and also talk about how future capacity and targets were determined, and I will have Pat talk to that. And then the scenarios that we're going to present to you have these three focuses. So we wanted to try to frame it in the context of some of the guiding principles. So the first one will be focused on socioeconomic equity. The second one is more on geography. And then the third scenario is sort of balancing the guiding principles. So, because there's so much to process, we thought that it would be good to put it in some context. And then, of course, we'll talk about the timeline and next steps and take questions and feedback. So this is these are the current districts as we see them, and the breakdown of the students by grade levels, and also some information on what the percentage of some demographics. So the percent reduced lunch currently, and the percentage of different racial mix as well. So this was a baseline for us to work with, which we keep coming back to and referring to. And these are some of the numbers that we have for current students and also projected students. So this gives you a sense, and this is something that we described in our presentation last time, was how we came up with these projected numbers. It was a process that we used with the demographer who gave us projected numbers, and then we used those numbers in the context of the components and then applied them to the scenario. So it was a multi-step process to come up with these projected numbers as well, and associating them with the school districts and with the eventual scenarios. So just to give you an overview, we're going to present these 5 scenarios to you. There are actually 3 scenarios, and the third one has 3 options. And of course, I'll get into details when we get to it. It is a lot of information. I'm going to try to go as slowly as possible and welcome questions. Each of them has a lot of data associated with them: the current student data, the projected future enrollment, the grade level breakdown, and also demographic information of the current demographics. When we were working on these, we decided that we wouldn't be making any specific recommendations at this time. We're presenting these as our first presentation to the community, and we'd like to get some feedback, go back to the drawing board as necessary, and make changes or tweaks, and then come with a recommendation. We also want to point out that these scenarios do fulfill the guiding principles, but at varying degrees, and that's what those 3 different categories that I mentioned at the beginning were, what the focus of the scenario was. And the bottom line, as we worked together on this, was we realized that there really is no perfect scenario which would meet all the guiding principles. And I think we've talked about this, that the guiding principles tend to work against each other in some cases. So you have to find the perfect balance, and really is no perfect, but find the balance that would work with all of them. Before we get into the scenarios, however, it's really important for the community to understand what are the numbers that we're working with, and how we, what is the basis of those numbers, and where the future enrollment capacity and targets come from. So I'll let Pat talk to this.
Sure. Thank you, Priya. In terms of our enrollment planning, of course, the new Beale School, when that was design capacity was determined and agreed upon with the Mass School Building Authority, there was an enrollment projection done and lots of data taken, and certainly this goal of decreasing enrollment at our existing elementary schools to take pressure off. Each of those schools over the years have had modular classrooms added that stress the core facilities, and then also spaces converted from regular education classrooms due to increased enrollment that were previously used for music or art, and kind of squeezed out space. So in working with the MSBA, a plan was put together that's shown here, which would basically have Coolidge, Patton, in spring have 15 classrooms each, if you will, at 5 grade levels with 3 sections for each grade, and an enrollment of about 300 students each. Floral is twice the size, it has 30 classrooms, that's what it was designed for, and that target enrollment of 608. And again, in red up above, it says the target enrollment that we're looking at and was planned for and projected was as of October 1st, 2025, not next year for the year that we open. The school was built with the understanding for room for growth and community growth. And so, by design, we know that we're not going to be filling all of these seats for the next several years, but we're going to have room to grow, and that's a good thing. And that the new Beale School, as a result, would have 40 classrooms and 8 sections for each grade level. In a perfect kind of world in the future, when everything kind of lined up and we did redistricting and if enrollment projections met the actuals. So when you see this term target enrollment in the future slides, what it's referring to is this basis back to the MSBA. And this basis back to the MSBA uses the school committee guidelines, which are on the box on the right, for kindergarten, a target enrollment for each grade, for each classroom to be between 17 and 19 students. Grades 1 and 2 for 20 to 22 students. Grades 3 and 4 to be between 22 and 24 students for each class. So when you apply those figures to the number of sections at each of these schools, that's how you get this kind of target enrollment for in the middle there, totaling up to just over 2,300 students. That's using the low end of the school committee guidelines. If one were to apply the high end, you could see that we could certainly still be within school committee guidelines, but be about 10% over that MSBA target figure. So as we go through and we look at, because we want to look at capacity and projected enrollment, I don't want folks to get too fixated on, oh, it says 308, but we've got 315, that's bad. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We're still, well within school committee classroom guidelines. And certainly if we were to be below that, that would be fine as well. We'd either have fewer sections or, manage like we do every year. We might have 1 fewer sections in grade 1 because it's a small cohort, and 1 more in grade 2, and so on and so forth. So we kind of just manage through that on a year-to-year basis. So there's some flex in here. That's the essence of these target enrollments, is there is some flexibility. I don't want people to get too hung up on, oh, it's at 102% capacity. That's, we can't sustain that option. We very likely could. It's just an indicator about planned enrollment capacity and how these components are breaking out in projected enrollment. So I don't want to dwell on it anymore. I just wanted to kind of, again, bring it to this essence that we've got some flex there in terms of these target capacities.
And I also just want to add to that to say that, when we do the analysis, we need a number to work with so that we can evaluate the scenario based on some number. And that's what we asked for. We need a number that, what is a target enrollment? And so what we have used is we have used these numbers, which are at the low end of the school committee guidelines in all our scenarios. So that's where the plus or minus 10% comes from. Okay, so I'm going to start with the scenarios with the focus on socioeconomic equity. I know this is a lot of words here, but I just want to point out that the committee spent a lot of time on this particular guiding principle. It was really important and came up a lot. Almost every scenario that we looked at was evaluated using this particular principle, and it was the first thing that everybody looked at. And several scenarios were considered, and this was the one that we decided to present for a variety of reasons. And there are, more severe options that we could show you, but this was the one that we felt was a little more nuanced with the socioeconomic equity. The pros, and I will be showing you the scenario, and then maybe we can come back to this. But I just want to talk about the fact that what we found was this had 30% reduced lunch students, which was the lowest of all the scenarios that we had put together. Some of the components needed to be moved, and the way we moved them sort of grouped them together, and so it made it a little more palatable that we would be potentially creating a full bus load of students that would have to be bused to another school. And the enrollment was also balanced in this particular scenario. There were several cons. There would be potential walkers to Coolidge, who would need to be transported to New Beal. There's some components in Floral that were going to be bused to New Beal. And of all the scenarios that we are presenting today, this one would displace the most students. And also, it wasn't looking very contiguous, and it looks a little engineered. So those are some of the the pros and the cons. And like I said, I will talk about them more when we look at the scenario.
And just a quick clarification: the 30% of reduced lunch students, that is at the Coolidge school. I don't think the bullet clarified which school that was at. Yeah,
correct. Thanks, Kate. And that's been the focus all the time. Is everybody's eye goes to the number at Coolidge and what the reduced lunch percentage is. So this is the scenario, and I will walk you through it slowly. As you can see, we described earlier in our previous presentation that all these components were built, and then the key thing is moving them around so that you can then get a scenario that you can work with. So as you can see in the scenario, whatever is the color, so the yellow is going to be the Spring Street school. This is going to be Floral. Whatever is blue is going to be Floral. Whatever is orange is going to be New Beal, and this is Coolidge and Patton. So the colors signify the school, that the new school district boundaries. The name of the component is where it was originally. So for example, as I was mentioning, Floral, this component is called Floral 13. And this is the one that we created, which has that apartment building development. And in this scenario, we're moving this one into New Beal. Similarly, Coolidge 9, which is another apartment building, will be moved to New Beal. Meanwhile, there are these Patton components and then some Spring components. So these are currently in Spring, and Patton would be moved to Floral. So that is...
Priya, we're not seeing your mouse on the screen.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I am. I apologize because it's on the other monitor.
Okay.
So thank you, Kate. This is the Floral 13 that I mentioned, a Floral component that is going to be moved to New Beal in this particular scenario. Coolidge 9 and all these Coolidge components moving to New Beal. Similarly, these components which were originally in Patton and these in Spring would then move to Floral. So that is the way this particular scenario was built to get the target enrollment that we have here, which is, this is all using current student locations and current student numbers. So that's really important to note that this particular slide, all these numbers that you look at are current student locations. So when, go ahead, Pat.
I just want to add for the folks that are watching and maybe even on the call here that the components that you're referring to, Coolidge 9, if you could just put your cursor on that, that's the Shrewsbury Green apartments. And we currently have 52 students there. And so it's under this scenario that those students would then be bused over to the new Beal School. And also in the orange Floral, I think it's 13, that's the Avalon apartments on Route 20. And we currently have 80 students there. And so while they're currently going to Floral, they would be bused over to the new Beal. So I just wanted to kind of name those two apartment complexes for folks that we're viewing so that they understand what those components represent.
So again, as you can see in the on the map, the name of the component signifies what school district they're currently in, and the color signifies what school they'd be going to in this particular scenario. It's really important to note that that's the way it is in this particular scenario, and we have many of these to show you. And as you can see in this, using the current distribution of students, this is what our distribution of enrollment would be. This is what the percentage of reduced lunch distribution would be. And this is what the demographic information on race would be in this current scenario. Each scenario has two slides associated with it, and that's where it gets a little more complicated. And now this one presents to you the projected information as well. So all of these numbers that you see up top are a projected distribution or projected numbers for each school district. And you also have projected percentages of the enrollment for each district. So, looking at this, as you can see, the distribution in this case is pretty good, even using the projected target enrollment and the current distribution as well. So I'm just going to snap back real quick to my previous slide of the pros and cons. This is what we were talking about. This is the Coolidge having a 30% reduced lunch, which is the lowest of all scenarios. And what I was talking about, Coolidge 8 needed to be moved to get this percent of the 30%. Moving Coolidge 2 and Coolidge 12 makes a potential bus route instead of just moving Coolidge 8. So you have this one, and it's close to this particular component, and so they would both be moving to New Deal. So that's somewhat of a pro in this scenario, and then the enrollment being balanced. But of course, there are all these cons, which would also have to be considered. And I think the aspect of the neighborhood school does get a little tested in this scenario. I don't know if you want to, Pat, should we take questions after each one or after the entire presentation?
Be up to the chair. How would you like to proceed? Do you want us to go through all this, or you want to pause at each one?
I think there's so much information with each of these. I would be fine if we take questions after each one. I think there's so much. But then we would have to take the slide deck down so I can see everybody since we're remote, if that's okay. But if that's a problem, okay, if that's okay. I know I did get a text asking for questions. So, all right, if anybody has a question, I think Lindsay did.
Thank you. There is obviously so much. So take this as a person who has not spent anywhere near as much time. And I really want to particularly thank all of our parent representatives who are committing a lot of their time to this endeavor and helping us. And I'm like you have multiple slide decks open, so I'm looking at some of the material. Can you? I'm trying to understand a little bit of averages for all the districts all the way across as we look at our elementary portfolio. So I think it's on one of your earlier slides. I don't know if I don't have numbers on the deck in front of me, but you have an early slide that says the current district and you break out each school and where they are today. And I guess while averages are imperfect and it's not the best way to make, it's a good reference point. And so I'm wondering, is it possible, and Pat, maybe this is stuff you can get to us at a future meeting too, but when I try to compare across these, I'm trying to figure out, are we getting all of our districts, all of our schools closer to an average? And there's lots of different data points. So I'm thinking both about reduced lunch and about, percent white and percent non-white, and trying to see where the, as you said, pros and cons are hard to figure out here and there's no perfect. But if that's something that in the future we could have, it might help me understand, in addition to the pros and cons as you're laying them out in the bullets, sort of where are we going as we kind of titrate by moving this group here and moving that group there. But maybe that's information you have.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I
Pat.
think, sure. I think if you have multiple screens open, I think if you looked at the third slide, I think that's the information that you're looking for, which is the current student population. And it shows there, the various demographics of indicators of white versus non-white students for each school, and then also the percentage of free and reduced lunch. Is that what you were looking for?
Yeah, and what I'd love to know, that is for responses for all of K-12. So if we average that off across all the districts, clearly, as we said, Coolidge is a marker we're looking at on a lot of these different ones. But I want to be able to say Coolidge is a really important marker, but is moving from 32% reduced lunch to 30% reduced lunch. Is that a big enough change compared to the overall average? So what is the average across the whole district, for instance, Patrick, for free and reduced lunch?
Sure.
Is that, I can't quite tell. I could do the math. I could figure that out if I had a little time, but there's a lot of data here and I don't want to slow you down. But in the future, that would be helpful so we could figure out where some of those pros and cons lie.
Sure, I might be able to pull out while we're on the call. So for district-wide, I think, like I said at the other meeting, that, this fall, for the first time as a district, the percentage of white students just for the first time fell below 50%.
Okay,
so
that's helpful.
As a district, we run about 50-50 white versus non-white.
That in and of itself is even a helpful benchmark for me. Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, thank you for pausing for the question as I try to, as you said, process all of the data. So I'll let you continue or take questions from others.
Sure. Any other questions from anyone, even any of the redistricting committee members while we're on here?
Hi, this is Tarek. I just wanted some clarification. In terms of what Lindsay was referring to about averages, and I don't know if those have to do with the tables that were generated for the scenarios, because I think all that I could see in terms of figures were numbers and percentages, unless she was referring to something else.
You're absolutely right, Tarek. In fact, I was going to follow that up, Lindsay. There's no averages. Those numbers that you see on that slide are the actual student numbers. And then I realized what you meant. You meant to see you want to see the percentage for K through 12. It's not an average. It's actually the percentage.
Right.
You're right. I'm misspeaking. Thank you, Tarek. No, for keeping me honest here. I'm looking for across elementary, what is the percentage for each of these, such that we can then compare how does each school, how far off the average, and maybe it's an average and a median, frankly, right, to help us figure out what each of those comes with the pros and the cons. Sorry, Tara.
And to kind of follow up on that, Lindsay, I mean, that has been kind of, one of my, anxieties throughout our deliberation and subcommittee meetings in terms of trying to find the sweet spot, right? Like, what's the threshold for some of these, numbers that we are looking at? And I think it's kind of been very difficult to kind of gauge because, again, I mean, we are dealing with a very organic, activity in terms of demographics and, all that stuff. But yeah, I kind of, really feel what you feel in terms of trying to figure out what is, the threshold, or what is the kind of, the sweet point, right? Or the midpoint, or whatever benchmark we set.
Anyone else before we move on? Nope, not seeing one. Great. Okay, thank you. All right, we can move on with the presentation.
Okay. So resume. Are you seeing my screen correctly? I'm just trying to navigate this.
Yes. Yep.
We're just seeing the title slide for that.
Okay. On the current slide. Sorry, PowerPoint is. Okay. Okay. Okay, do you see that now? So the next scenario is a more geographically compact and contiguous scenario. And I think this is another thing that tends to happen for all of us. We want to look at it everything very neatly and following the right lines and not moving around too much. So we put together one scenario which would follow that criteria. So in this particular one, we've done the best that we can when it comes to making it compact and contiguous. And of course, the enrollment is balanced, which is another important piece. The cons, of course, in this one are that the Coolidge reduced lunch percentages become very high. It's the 37% in this case. And some spring and pattern potential walkers are moved. So, they would not be walking anymore in this scenario. And then to maintain compactness, the components that we struggled with the most were pattern 7 and 8. If you wanted to keep them in pattern and not send them to New Deal, then we have to forego some walkers. So it's sort of this balance of, how should we handle that when it comes to, and you will see that in the next group of scenarios as well. So that's what's happening in this one. Is it's all compact. All the pattern components are together as much as as best we could, except for spring moved into pattern, and all the floral components are also contiguous. So there's no one component being shipped across for balancing out anything. So that's what's happening in this scenario. Just to show you the number breakdown, again, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong screen. So as you can see, again, the target enrollment in this one, the reduced lunch is really high. As far as the enrollment is concerned, it is relatively balanced. And I can show you that again in the projected slide. We're fine here on the projected enrollment and on the current distribution of students as well. And this is what I was talking about, the pattern 7 and 8 being in pattern. And then, of course, these potential walkers being sent to New Deal. And then, of course, all of Coolidge is as compact as we could get it. But then, of course, the current percentage when it comes to reduced lunch goes up significantly. So that's what a geographically compact and contiguous scenario looks like. And I'll kind of go back to my pros and cons slide, which lists it out that some spring and pattern potential walkers. And I think it's these that are potential walkers and some spring walkers as well, who would not be sort of breaking that neighborhood feel. And then pattern 7 and 8 stay in pattern, and the pattern 14 and 2 go to New Deal. So those are the pros and the cons of this, this particular scenario. So questions?
Any questions on this? And I feel bad we have to keep taking your PowerPoint down.
I can see folks if you want me to.
Sure.
Help
That'd
moderate
be good,
that.
Pat. Yeah, so we can
Okay.
leave this up.
Just as a point of reference, so as a district, the most recent data is for free and reduced lunch eligibility is 20%. So, that would be the case across all of our elementaries and across our district as well.
Thank you, Pat. That's very
Sure.
helpful.
And I'll keep up the slide of the projections, I think.
And I don't see any other questions at this point.
Oh, all right, so we can go on.
Okay, and then the third group of scenarios, we attempted to balance all the guiding principles, and of course, some of them will be weighed more than the others. So this is the first option, and the other two options, I just want to caution you, are just a slight tweak of the first option. So this is what the primary base option is. You will notice that in this scenario, we've actually left spring 3 in spring. So a little more of the keeping in mind the neighborhood walkability, including pattern 14 in pattern. And like I mentioned previously, if we kept this component in pattern, then we'd have to move these two into New Deal, because that just doesn't, if we kept all of that in pattern, our numbers would go up significantly. So that is one of the things that happens in this one. A whole swath of this northern part of Coolidge and Patton all comes into New Deal. Coolidge becomes a little more compressed. One of the Coolidge components on the south side of town go into a New Deal. And then what's happening in this one is that the Avalon development, Floral 13, is moving to New Deal, but Pattern 2 stays in Floral. So, and then the other thing that we did on this option or scenario is that we made sure that we kept a component which currently, of course, doesn't have any students, but this is keeping in mind our future developments that we're expecting and planning for them to go to New Deal. But we didn't want to use all of the students, all of these, the development in this component, Floral 4. So we divided that up, and in this scenario, Floral 4 stays in Floral, but then Floral 5, we made sure that it stays in New Deal for the future expected developments. So this is what's happening in this, what we are calling the balanced scenario. You'll see that, and I think this is where the whole target enrollment slide that Patrick spoke towards, I think helps there, because when we look at these numbers, we should remember that there is plenty of room at spring, but it'll be fine to have this number. And I think that's a decision that the school committee will have to make, or everybody will have to make, as to what's the comfort level. But this is what the numbers look like once in this particular scenario. And the next two that I'm going to show you are just variations of this one. So I'll skip through them quickly. This is the second option. And as you can see, what we did was, it's just changes to pattern 2 and Floral 13, trying to see if we kept Floral 13 in Floral instead of busing them to New Deal, what happens to the target enrollment then, which you can see more clearly, that puts Floral at 113%. So we said, okay, if that's the case, then what if we kept floral 13 there, but then moved pattern 2 into New Beal? And so that's what option 3 is just a variation where pattern 2 goes into New Beal and floral 13 stays in floral. And then you get, this is the projected target enrollment numbers that you get in that scenario. So what I will do is I have a slide which actually shows you all 3 and shows you what the differences are. So this is a base one that I showed you, and the only differences between the 3 scenarios is swapping out pattern 2 and floral 13, which is in the base scenario, pattern 2 stays in floral and or goes to floral, and floral 13 to New Beal. In the second option, we kept both of them in floral. And then in the third option, pattern 2 moves to New Beal and floral 13 stays in floral. And then you can see the what happens to the numbers when we do that. And that's what I've highlighted in this slide. And I'll just look at the pros and cons, and we can come back to the comparison. So we've sort of listed the fact that the projected target enrollment is balanced. Of course, there are some numbers that are a little high, but it's balanced. Neighborhood, we have kept that in mind with Spring 3, pattern 14, Coolidge. All of these are potential walkers or close to their schools, so we've kept them in their schools. We have planned for future development by keeping the components where future developments are expected in New Beal, so that because that's where there's room. As far as minimizing change, the second and the third option have the least number of students displaced of all the scenarios considered. And then, of course, the reduced lunch distribution is maintained to the best of our ability. And I think what I put it as is I call it considerations, because if you are looking at all these 3, you would have to consider the potential longer commute for these pattern 7 and 8, some potential pattern walkers to floral sent to New Beal. Are those really walkers? Is it fine for them to go to New Beal? And option 2 is the most contiguous for floral, but then floral is at 113 at that point. And in option 3, the choice of moving pattern to New Beal balances floral further. So those are all the pros of these options, and then what you'd need to consider looking at these options. And in this map, I've shown you the third option. So I'm going to go back to our distribution of those 3.
So any questions on those? I know Pat can see. Anybody has any questions?
Comments?
Comments, right. It's a lot. There's a lot of information.
Lindsay? I see your hand is up.
I'm sorry. I feel like I'm struggling more than some of my colleagues here. And it's not that it's a lot of information. It's that when we look at our overall principles, and the ones that really jump out at me are, you've mentioned them in different moments tonight, right? Balancing your neighborhood compactness, about growth and minimizing change. I want to certainly commend you that overall on the minimizing change front, it seems like between all the variabilities, we're plus or minus 50 additional students moving from one school to or not. And so I think that's to be commended, and we're trying to keep as many kids in their spaces as they can, knowing this is a huge disruption for our elementary schools, but with a really positive end goal. Let me back up a minute, because as my earlier questions underscore, the issue of equity is probably first and foremost at my mind. It was always important to us as we came about thinking about this process, I know, as a district, but even more so over the last year, I think has become a really important consideration for us. And I'd love to just think about, so how do we think about issues of equity? Do we think, so we're kind of trying to look very, very closely at numbers, but we're looking at free and reduced lunch and largely race and ethnicity. But and have other districts at times looked at things like English as a second language or English language learners or special education, or what does it mean to balance equity? Because all of these also don't seem to make major shifts if we keep our eye on Coolidge. We go from 32% free and reduced lunch at Coolidge down to a low of 30 up to a high of 37. Like, we're still seem pretty close. And so my question is maybe a little more global about thinking about equity, and it's not that these numbers aren't important numbers. Are they the most important, or are they telling us the whole story? Or are we maybe missing any forest for trees when we think about how to balance this? That's kind of a big loaded question, but
no, yeah, maybe Patrick, you can speak to it, because we did map those criteria as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those were previous maps that we looked at with respect to the distribution of our current ELL students across the district, as well as the students who are currently on an IEP.
Okay.
There certainly are, it's not a perfect distribution, and we shouldn't try to look for a perfect distribution, because I don't think that's achievable. But it's fairly evenly spread. Those two, the ELL populations seem to be fairly well distributed across town. That's not something that, as I recall, had great concentrations in one area over another. Special education, again, was, I think, fairly well distributed across elementary schools, some having fewer and some having more. But again, that, we did look at those. And I mean, my sense is, my input on this is that because of they're fairly well dispersed already, that trying to factor that in as another layer as part of a component, really, I don't know that we could really make any more progress there on those two particular pieces. What seemed to come to the forefront was that there was a greater disparity, if you will, or greater concentration with respect to free and reduced lunch kids. Of course, the highest population at the Coolidge School District currently, and the lowest at Spring Street School. That seemed to be kind of the most distinct difference, if you will. And so that was the one that, we discussed, I think, the most, in trying to balance out the best that we could in the context of the other guiding principles. But certainly other folks on the redistricting committee should feel free to chime in if I've missed something.
I do just want to add something. Mr. Collins mentioned that they will be creating a scenario that we can take a look at and discuss that does try to more evenly distribute socioeconomic diversity. That's something I was really interested in looking at, because it, as you mentioned, it's currently not really shown in these options, but that is something that is coming, and that's something I'm personally very interested in.
Exactly. Thank you, Snow. We're going to look at those at our next redistricting committee meeting. I know AppGeo will have a couple of maps for us to look at that really flip things around to try to make those percentages closer to equal across elementary schools.
If I can just respond, Madam Chair, I know we're hard to follow decorum here on this virtual platform this evening, but I did in any way, of course, mean to assume that you hadn't looked at those things. I think it's helpful to the community to know that you did and that you thought about it. And if things like ELL and special education are not as helpful in this matter because they're well evenly distributed, then we shouldn't be paying attention to them. We should be paying attention to places where we see disparities between our schools, and we're trying to get closer to some degree of parity. So thank you for just letting us know, and And I should have assumed you had already done that good work, but I think it's also helpful for the community to know that you've done that, and then therefore focused in on these couple of points of demographics, which clearly don't represent everything that is robust and unique about our students and our demographics, but these are particular ones where we'd like to see come to some greater parity across all 5 buildings going forward.
And I think if I could just add that if somebody wanted to look at, and I think or reference later, that those 2 slides that I just referenced with students on IEPs and both ELL are on our website right now. They were part of the community forum.
Yep.
So people can see those distributions themselves if they want to reference those slides.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is Dale. Can I make a comment? I don't think I'm on anybody's screen.
Sure, Dale.
Okay. I just would like to make 2 observations. One is that when we talk about breaking things down by race into white and non-white, this traces back to districts where non-white usually equaled African American, and it traced back to districts where those non-whites were not being treated fairly, they did not have adequate resources, and therefore there was a need to try to bring equity by virtue of making sure that the racial distribution was the same, and to measure it to be sure that people weren't trying to move out of the district and further the unfairness to the African Americans that were within the district. Within Shrewsbury, if we look at non-white, we're not looking at a primarily African American population, we're looking at a primarily Asian population. And my observation has been that this group has been very thoughtful about the quality of education that they receive. They have made a conscious effort to select a school district or a school neighborhood that met their needs, both from a point of view of quality of education, as well as the opportunity of having the affiliation and support of their peers. And so it is a different picture from my point of view. And I feel that in some ways we are seeking to undo a conscious thought being raised by people who place a high value on their education and who are where they are because they're where they want to be. The second comment I want to make has to do with socioeconomic equity. And I can say that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my strong belief that the path out of poverty lies through a good education. But I also feel that having a student who may have parents who are not college educated, who may not speak English as a first language, who may not have opportunities for enrichment at home, and equalizing things by putting them in a district in which their classmates may be 2 PhDs is not necessarily furthering their opportunity to better their education. More important from my point of view is that they be located in a school that recognizes their needs, that recognizes the fact that plain vanilla doesn't work for them, and that they are going to need resources that other students may not need. And so I question those 2 big ideas of trying to equalize socioeconomic status. I think that may not work very well at all, quite the opposite. And also the issue regarding white, non-white, since I think there are dimensions to that perspective that we may actually be offending the people we think we're helping. That's my statement.
Thank you, Dale. Anyone else?
Madam Chair, if I might.
Sure, Jason.
Just a few comments. First of all, I want to thank the members of the redistricting committee as well as our consultants for their work on this. I know that this is work that involves a tremendous amount of attention to detail and many factors to weigh. So I do appreciate the work of both our consultants and the volunteers who have taken part in this. I just want to make a comment as we weigh a number of different factors here. You know, there's one that actually has come up a few times that I actually feel sort of compelled to note as actually not being of particular concern for me. Obviously, there are a number of factors we're weighing, most of which are of great concern to me. Chief among them, like Ms. Heffernan, is equity. I do want to make sure that from a number of different perspectives, we're considering equity when we draw these district lines. I do want to make sure that we are doing our best to keep neighborhoods together in a way that it doesn't seem nonsensical, that one group of homes is with one school and another is not. And then, of course, transportation and logistics, where one neighborhood may look physically close to a school, but if there aren't connecting roads. But one topic that's come up a few times that I just want to note is not a particular concern to me is contiguity of the map. The map, I think, is going to look a little unusual no matter what solution we take. So there were a few references to cons in the presentation of some of the maps as looking engineered or not having terrible contiguity. Certainly, I'm concerned with, two homes across the street from one another, not having a bizarre situation where one is in one district and another is in another. But I think the smaller neighborhood units do a lot to prevent that. I feel that the map itself is not something that people engage with much. We have a map in place now for 4 districts. Most people haven't seen it or don't know how to interact with it. Maybe it's just because we only have 4 schools right now, and it's sort of easier to get sort of a mental sense of where the various neighborhoods are. But long story short, too late, sorry. I don't feel that the map itself is something that people are going to engage with much. Students aren't looking at the map when they go to school in the morning. Parents aren't looking at the map when they're thinking about their child's education. So if we do wind up at a solution where the map has a couple of odd turns here or there, I just want to make clear that to me is not a problem, because I'm not so much concerned with the map itself as I am with the experiences that we're creating. So, but again, just want to echo other comments that were made about thanking the committee for their work.
Thank you, Jason. And again, I can't see everyone, so if there's anyone who has a comment or a question, as well as on the redistricting committee, just speak up.
Yeah, Madam Chair, it's Mr. Winsky. Sorry, I'm not on screen, but I do want to make a few quick comments. First off, there's a lot of information here to digest. I know, especially for those that are new to the process, or this might be the first time that you're watching the discussion around field redistricting. There's been a lot of careful thought and consideration, as you've seen throughout the presentation, and really finding the balanced scenario within the agreed upon guiding principles for this committee is really the main objective, right? I mean, there's a lot of critical work that this committee has done and will continue to do. And how do we strike that balance across the guiding principles? There's no way to satisfy every situation. As Priya said, certainly there's no one perfect scenario that will check all the boxes, but I keep going back to Dr. Sawyer's motto post-COVID around patience, flexibility, and grace. And I think the same applies to the complexities and challenges that come with the change management around redistricting. So really, just with those comments, I just want to say I appreciate the time and energy and the engagement of this committee. There's been some really good dialogue and discussion across the several meetings. I also want to thank Patrick Collins and AppGeo for being great partners throughout this process. You can tell that both Patrick and AppGeo have done this before, and it makes the process, certainly for us as committee members, a lot easier to make an informed decision. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Is there anyone else before we move forward? Just speak up.
This is Tarek.
Yep.
And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Dale for, I really appreciated the clarity and the eloquence with which you made your point, which I can I would say that I kind of wholly support. And we've had a lot of discussions, centering around some of these factors, some of which and I think I've made this point, and a lot of us have also kind of made this point that we wouldn't be able to solve all these problems. I mean, some of them are geographical. There are situational issues that cannot be just solved in this way. And I think at the last meeting that we had, there was a consensus that we are kind of arrived at. I don't know if it was expressed, but I could feel that all of us kind of understood that making resources available to whichever school zone or school whatever to support our students would essentially meet the needs that we are trying to address in trying to design this map. So the map is just a representation of so many factors, so many factors. But beyond that, really looking at trying to meet the needs of students, and some of them are very specific needs and very specific, school zones, what would be needed. And so I believe that when we go back into our meetings, we'll be going over some of these discussions again. But I really appreciate you expressing those, because I think it's these are views that I share myself. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Anyone else?
Madam Chair, may I follow up with a question about how this impacts all of the schools? And Patrick, this might be best directed to you, but obviously to any other members. I am most familiar with Patton. That's the school my kids have gone to, but I'm hoping this is true for others. I'm noticing that we're anticipating potentially like 15 core classes in Patton. If I have it right now, I think there's 17, give or take one or two. So what I understand that would mean is that, for instance, in the Patton schools, by doing this redistricting, by opening Beale, we are providing at least one, maybe two more classrooms for things like getting art in the cart, not on a cart, right? Getting it back into a classroom, or having extra room for special education services and kids not maybe in hallways. I am hoping that I'm making assumptions there. So I'm wondering if you can confirm that is true, and if that's true across all of our other buildings that are in many ways pushed to capacity. Because I think that's an important piece of this. So why we're doing this is, getting through the pain of the next year of making this change is often to help all of our kiddos across the building. So could you speak a little bit?
Sure.
If I'm on the right track there?
Absolutely. And I think I want to make a couple brief comments and then turn it over to Tiffany Ostrander, because she just went through an exercise for planning for next year. So basically, with respect to Patton School right now, although we're in COVID conditions, on paper, we have 18 classrooms, core classrooms, K through 4. That's classroom sections of kids. So by going from 18 to a planned 15, they'll be able to do exactly what you just said. That is part of the design here, is to repurpose classroom space at those schools for dedicated spaces for art, music, English language learners, things like that on a permanent basis, so that there is parity of types of spaces with the new Beale School. And with that, I would ask Tiffany and Brian maybe to both maybe talk a little bit about how they just went through a planning exercise to do some of that work, and maybe give a couple of examples. Maybe Tiffany could start, and then Brian.
Definitely. As part of the work in preparing for redistricting, when we look at the target enrollment, we've been taking some of these numbers and thinking about, if we shrunk Coolidge by a particular number of students, about 95 or so, how many rooms would that open? In which grades would we see our classroom sizes go down? So we went through the current building map, just kind of using that architectural design. And I went through and just color coded, all the first grade rooms we're going to use are yellow, second grade rooms are blue, etc. And then I was able to see which spaces are now open to be reutilized for other purposes. So we'll need our art room will go back to the way it was pre-COVID. So we'll have an art room again. We'll have a music room. We'll be able to have our cafeteria be a cafeteria and our gym be a gym, hopefully moving forward. And we'll have lots of extra space, especially for our ESL program and our special education classrooms. That's where we're a bit cramped right now. And then we're also excited because it's looking like we'll have additional space for our ELC students as well. So we'll be able to grow a bit there and kind of expand, so they have some more space for learning too, which seems to be much more equitable to what the new Beale will have as well.
So we went through I went through the exact same process that Tiffany went through, and identified where the reductions would come, what classrooms could potentially be open, and then knowing what our needs are. Currently, our music classroom is a stage in the cafeteria, which is not ideal, but conducive to learning at the moment. We're hoping to move our music teacher into a classroom. And then we've been short on special education space. As a matter of fact, one of the spaces has been a closet with no door on it, but we've had to move people out of there because there's no ventilation. So combined with people being in spaces that are cramped quarters and not appropriate for ventilation and conducive to learning, as in music, we're hoping that with the opening up of classrooms, we'll be able to have some spaces that are equitable to what the new BEAL will have.
I think, Madam Chair, the point here is that I think for the community, it speaks a little bit to what I think Mr. Andy and Dr. McGee are getting at, that quality education is really what we're ultimately about. And I'm not saying that Art in the Cart they're not making do, but what we all know is what is high quality is having the space to do and meet the principles that we've sort of laid out for all of our students, and having that across all of the district. And we're cramped now everywhere right now, and COVID adds extra layers of peculiarity. But I think that's a really important piece for us to keep in mind as community members. And when we talk about this, that at the end of the day, whether one kid's parents their kids are going to the shiny new Beal school, which looks beautiful as it's nearing completion, every kid is going to get a better level of service by having more space across all forms of particularly supportive instruction, which is exciting. So thank you.
Right, and I think that is the key piece, is regardless of what elementary school your child attends, they will all receive the best education. And it is unsettling to think about a child having to switch schools. No one wants to have that happen. But with the redistricting and having a new school come online, when it happened with Floral, we had to go through that process, and we're going to have to do that again. And it is, like Mr. Wensky said, it's about balance and making sure that we do the best job we can and looking at the guiding principles. And this, I think, has been an amazing redistricting committee. It is a very thoughtful group looking at the guiding principles and really, really thoughtful discussions. That we have like 2.5 hour meetings, and they fly by because there's so much information. And thank you to the committee again. And this meeting tonight, again, you learn something new every time. So I'd ask the school committee, to take a look through this information. I'm going to ask Mr. Collins to go through the timeline and the meeting schedule next, so we see what's coming next. We have our meeting on the 20th, when a final recommendation will be made to us. And then we will have a final vote on the 10th. So we've got a lot to look at between now and then. So if Mr. Collins, if you could go through that meeting schedule, then I'd ask Dr. Sawyer if he has any questions or comments before we wrap this up.
Yep, I think it's the next to last slide. I think it's one more. There we go. So obviously we're at the 6th here, providing kind of the current state of the specific options at play. We do have a second community forum on January 12th that all community members will be able to listen in and see some of the same information that we provided to you in case they're not listening tonight. And they'll also be able to submit online real-time questions and answers like we did at the first community forum. The redistricting committee has another meeting on the following Thursday on the 14th. We're going to try to narrow the options that you saw tonight down to maybe a couple, and see if we can't give a stronger recommendation for one of them, and then present that to you on the 20th. There is a scheduled public hearing, so that on the 27th, again, community members could give kind of one final level of input directly to the school committee. And then that sets it all up for your vote planned for February 10th. And then it's important to stick to that date so that we can, finalize plans and then communicate. So obviously, in this time, there's so much going on in the world, in our country, and that it's hard to pay attention to everything at once. And I think it's fair to say that there are a number of folks that probably are just either completely unaware or just partially aware of this kind of impending change. So it might very well be that the first time that they hear that their students are going to XYZ school or staying at their school, that it might be the first time that they hear it. So we want to do that as soon as possible. We can in the March timeframe, communicate, and then so that will allow us to then make busing plans and have parents make transportation plans for the upcoming school year, and then we can plan our staff planning as well for the opening of New Beal. So that's the schedule ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Collins. Dr. Sawyer, do you have any comments or questions?
I just also want to thank the redistricting committee. The members have done an outstanding job throughout the process. I think a very strong process was set up. I think our partners from AppGeo have done an excellent job responding to our needs and providing us with the tools to make this a doable approach. And I'm confident in the process. I believe that the school committee charged the redistricting committee with an excellent set of guiding principles. I think they represent a variety of issues that are important to our families. While inevitably some families will be disappointed when they're going to have to move their child, partway through their elementary experience, it's a good problem to have in a sense, because all of our families are very satisfied and loyal to the school community they're part of. We're not in a situation where people are looking to leave their school community for something that they might perceive to be better. In terms of, equity is an important concept. It's not really illustrated per se in the school committee guidelines. It talks about making sure, trying to the extent possible, having school communities represent the demographics of the overall demographics of the town. That said, it's very important to us that no matter what the situation is in terms of the student population, that they're being provided with an equitable and excellent education by the Shrewsbury Public Schools, and I'm confident we'll continue to do that. We can always improve upon that. We're seeking ways to do that and improve that. We feel good that regardless of what school a child will attend, that they will have the opportunity to be well prepared. And I can certainly say that it is, really not been an issue in terms of when our students arrive all together at Sherwood to share fifth grade. It is not obvious, which students would attend in which school, because they've all had the same curriculum, they've all had excellent educators, and they've all had the opportunity for success. So with that, we look forward to the next meetings and the process to play out, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from the redistricting committee at our next meeting, and ultimately being part of making the recommendation to the school committee for a preferred option.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer, and thank you for everyone for joining with us this evening. Okay, next on the agenda under Finance and Operations, Mr. Collins and Dr. Sawyer will provide a detailed 5-year fiscal projection that incorporates known in upcoming major costs or expenditures in achievement of the district's strategic priorities. So I'll turn it back over to Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. This is a very important report. It signals the beginning of the budget process. It's a little bit of a pre-budget report in that it really looks at the overall situation we are in and projects out into the future. We remain very concerned about the structural financial situation that we are in as a community, which we've talked about in a variety of ways many times over the years. We need to continue to talk about what the constraints are relative to providing adequate funding for our schools to do all that's expected of us and all that we should be doing for the students of Shrewsbury. Mr. Collins has done an excellent job providing a 5-year financial projection that he will provide some information about. I will share some information about ways in which this structural deficit has compromised our ability to provide all that we can and should, and then ask the committee for some reflections and comments on that. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Mr. Collins.
Okay, and I do want to just check that you can see the PowerPoint presentation that I've just shared.
We can see it. If you can put it on display mode or presentation mode, that'll make it a little bigger for us.
How's that?
Yep,
Okay.
better, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to run through a series of facts relative to our budget information. And I just want to make some preparatory or preface comments here that, this is all, of course, leading up to, as Dr. Sawyer alluded to, a very difficult next couple of years that we're looking at financially, and that this has not been caused by COVID. This situation was pre-existing, as evidenced by the current fiscal year before COVID. We were in a budget situation where there weren't enough resources to support the budget as presented by the superintendent, and ultimately we had to close approximately $2 million gap and cut a whole number of staff, about 28, 29 staff members in various programs. Some of that we're going to get into. So this was a pre-existing problem. It's not COVID related. Certainly COVID has exacerbated the revenue problem that we're all experiencing, whether it be on the town or school side or as a state or nationally. So that's just made things worse and made them more urgent, if you will. But so here's just a series of facts, and this 5-year financial forecast is really an update of the work that was done previously and talked about and presented back in February 2017. At that time, both Mr. Samia and Dr. McGee worked a lot on that 5-year forecast back then. And so this is really an update of that work. And this first slide shows a 20-year budget history. This is the town appropriated budget. And so we're going to look at a long span of data here so that we can take a look at trends that will help us bring certainty or more certainty to the future of what we can expect. So this 20-year, back in 2001, we were a town appropriated budget of 27.9 million. Increases most of the years, and at fiscal 21, we're at $68 million. In terms of the same time span, you can see the various dollar increases that occurred over this time span, with a range of a decrease of 1.26 million during the Great Recession to an increase of just over 5.1 million in fiscal 2015, which was the year of the override, and then lots of variations in between those intervening years. This represents the various percentage increases for that same time span. Again, from 2001 at 6.2% annual increase to an 8.3%, 5s and 6s, a negative 2.7. Again, a high in the override year of 9.91% annual increase, and then thereafter, post-override, more modest increases in the 2 to 3% range. So what does this look like in terms of kind of 5-year increments, or various more than 5-year increments? On a 20-year average, the average annual percentage increase for the school budget has been 4.59%. That's the 20-year average. When you look at the next closest 15 years, goes down to just over 4%. The next, the closest 10 years, fiscal 12 to 21, so 3.76. And then the most recent 5-year period is an average of 3% annual increases. Just another couple of time spans to look at, which would be, so what happened from the override year, fiscal 15 to the present? Average annual increases, 3.92%. And then what happened after the override? Average annual increases of 2.93%. So you can kind of see what the various time periods have been, and then again, including override to present and post-override. Just another way to look at some of the same data, what's been the median for that 20-year period? The median percentage increase was 5.52%. So again, for some of those that might be watching this, this might sound like lots of dollars, which they are. We are the largest entity in the town in terms of an operating budget. But in terms of our cost efficiency, it's just an important reminder to let folks know that we do run a very cost-efficient operation historically over that time span. And this shows the average cost per pupil in the blue, state average cost per pupil, the most recent data, fiscal 19, the average cost was just over $17,000 per pupil on average spending. And Shrewsbury's for that same time period is just over $14,000. So it's a $2,900 difference per student, or we are 17% below state average in terms of spending per pupil. What is that in a smaller group? This smaller group are the communities that have similar socioeconomics as measured by ClearGov, which is the kind of independent third-party group that aggregates lots of this data and publishes that publicly. And folks can see this if they want to by clicking into the ClearGov website right now. But you can see with our socioeconomic peers, even that in that group, North Attleboro had an average cost per pupil of just over $13,850 and a high in Natick of just over $16,000. So just in that comparison group, we fare very well just in terms of efficient use of dollars. So I just wanted to remind folks of that. So taking some of that data and just kind of shifting it to help us look to the future. We also wanted to factor known and upcoming major costs like opening up the new Beale School in terms of preparing a 5-year forecast. This 5-year forecast is going to look at fiscal 22, next fiscal year, and then the 4 succeeding years. And then also how we might plan for actually some improvements in achievement of our strategic priorities, because those would take additional resources. And we want to plan for that as opposed to a slow degradation of the quality of our services or even eliminating more programs. So what are the assumptions behind this 5-year forecast? So basically the cost assumptions are that our labor agreements, of course, which are not settled for the next 5 years, but that they would settle out near recent COLA annual cost of living increases or adjustments that we've seen in the past. That our out-of-district placements costs would rise with inflation as they do every year. That our pre-K through 12 enrollment looks to be relatively flat over the next 5 years, not major significant increases, and that transportation costs would follow the economic increases as well. The revenue assumptions in these have borne out to be fairly true over in the past, that federal and state grants would remain relatively flat on the whole. We're assuming that the circuit breaker reimbursement program, which provides, this year probably about $3 million in funding, would remain that the way that they run that program, that level of funding would still continue to provide us between 70 and 75% reimbursement for so-called high cost special education students. That the full day kindergarten tuition would be officially eliminated for fiscal 22. Of course, it's been waived for this year as well. But, as a reminder, Shrewsbury this year is, as of last year, was one of only 38 communities in the entire Commonwealth that still charge the tuition. So as a policy decision, we know that the school committee has planned to officially eliminate that for the upcoming year. So that's built into this forecast. And as has the assumption that other fees like busing and student activity fees, athletic fees would have kind of the annual incremental increases that they've seen in the years past as well. So those are all the assumptions behind this 5-year forecast. So based upon that, we're looking at using 2 models for forecasting based upon all this data, that our upcoming 5-year average or annual increases would need to be 4.5% annually. And that if we want to actually make some improvement, that we'd need another 0.5% to make some investment in strategic priorities. We've done some preliminary work, actually more than preliminary now. We're bringing it to a close to present to you soon, early next month, the first fiscal 22 budget. And we're looking at what we now know to be in the range of an 8.5% increase needed as a minimum just to maintain existing programs, plus an additional approximately $2 million to open up the new Beal School. The 8.5% is certainly higher than usual, and it's necessary because in this current year, certainly with the collaboration between the school committee and the labor unions, teachers union and the assistant principals union, that there were salary deferments made and reductions made for this year only. And so that their salaries would fall back in line with the previously bargained agreements for fiscal 22, and that we need to build in another $1.1 million just to fill that gap alone. And other, we took savings that were realized because of COVID, like we didn't have to employ as many substitute teachers and have other operating costs. Those savings, if you will, were carried into this fiscal year. And those are one-time savings. So we need to make up all of those savings as we begin fiscal 22. Those were just survival tactics to get through this current fiscal year. But we need to make those things up in terms of having a baseline budget for fiscal 22. And that is really what's driving probably going to be in the range of 8.5% increase needed for fiscal 22. That's part of the assumption. So here are the models. That's a lot of information trying to summarize what these charts are going to look like here. Fiscal 21, of course, is where we are presently. That's the green bars at just over $68 million. The blue bars are the assumption for the next 5 years, fiscal 22 being an 8.5% increase, plus $2 million for opening Beal. And then for fiscal 23 and 26 into 26, annual increases of 4.5%. And then in fiscal 22, it would be a 9% increase, so 8.5% plus 0.5% for strategic investment, plus the $2 million for opening Beal, and then thereafter 5% annual operating increases. So you can see the numbers there range between 75 million for fiscal 22 up to fiscal 26, a $92.5 million operating budget. I do want to make mention right now that the prior work, as I referenced earlier, that was done by Mr. Samia primarily and Dr. McGee, that when they worked on in partnership with the central office, that 5-year forecast for that time period, the forecast for fiscal 21, which was made back in February of 2017, called for a budget of $71.2 million. That's what was forecast. And interestingly, Dr. Sawyer's initial request was $70.6 million. So when you look at that, that forecast was 99.2% accurate looking forward using the assumptions that were used back then. It's a fairly short window of time. It's not a big window of time that we're looking forward here. So, and we have a lot of data that we can look at in the past to help predict the future. So these predictions that you're looking at here, and while the numbers do grow and get bigger, I think we can have a fair degree of confidence that this is what is necessary to carry forward the existing programs into a succeeding 5-year period and open up the Beal School. This slide basically then takes that data, the blue and the orange and blue lines, which are the school department cost projections, 5-year forecast. And then by working with the town manager, he had made a forecast as well with respect to what upcoming revenues might be, and resultingly what operating budgets might have to be for town departments and the school department. And he had factored in 3% annually, or for fiscal 22, pardon me. And then for fiscal 23, 3.5%, and fiscal 23 to 26, 3.25%. And also including $2 million for opening up Beal next year. That's the gray line. So the town manager projection, if you will, is using that gray line. And you can see it's far below the school department projection and needs. And this is not a commentary on Mr. Mizikar or what he thinks the school department ought to get. He's just looking at data, just like we're looking at data, and what revenue might be currently available under the current conditions. All of those models, by the way, including the town manager's projection, at those levels, the town is in deficit in each and every of those five-year budgets. There is an operating deficit. So what are those deficits? That's what this slide shows. And you can see in the blue bar, basically the most modest, if you will, or the town manager's projection, to the orange bar, which is the school department projection using 8.5% for year one and then 4.5% thereafter. And then in red, using 9% for fiscal 22 and 5% thereafter. Those are the resulting deficits. So again, even using the most modest town manager projection, looking at a $2.3 million deficit overall townwide, school and town combined, $2.3 million deficit for fiscal 22. So we certainly have a financial problem here. And finally, I guess I just wanted to show this slide, which is one that we've used before, and it is telling in the fact that we know that each year the blue bar is what initially has been the superintendent's recommendation, and then the red bar has been what has been the resulting budget increases approved by town meeting, and it's always different. We always have resulted in getting less than what was recommended initially. As a result of that, many programs have been eliminated. Many staffing positions have been eliminated. And certainly class sizes have risen along that time span as well. And Dr. Sawyer is going to go into those pieces right now.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I'll be as brief as possible. I think it's just really important to note, we're very fortunate to have a very successful school district. And, we have a variety of resources in terms of capital investments in new school buildings over the last 2 decades. We have outstanding educators. We've been very smart about our investment in technology. But the reality is we've not been able to fund everything that we'd like. And there are things that people who have moved here or who've had their students start over the last several years who would not know some of the reductions in program that we've made in past years that we've never had returned. 6 years ago, when the override was accomplished by the community, it brought us back from some bad cuts we'd experienced and reduced class sizes from some that were unacceptably high as a result of where we were at that time. But over the last, even since that time, we've continued to see erosion of some of the gains we made back. And the reality is we've not been able to fund everything that we can and should be funding for our school district. Some examples of that, over the past couple of decades, and focusing a little bit more earlier, but despite this annual average of 4.5% budget increases, again, we've had some programs eliminated or reduced. And at the same time, the school committees implemented user fees and periodic increases in those fees that have put more financial pressure on families. Next slide, please. Thank you. The educational services and programs that we've lost, just to go through quickly some examples. Just this past year, we eliminated classroom teaching positions that increased class sizes, 3 of them at the high school, 2 at Sherwood. We cut our elementary literacy tutor hours by 40%, and we know if kids don't learn to read effectively by 3rd grade, oftentimes that creates other costs down the road. Number of years ago, we eliminated foreign language in we used to have it all the way to grade 3, and we eliminated that. We eliminated grade 4. A number of years ago, we eliminated grade 5. And now this year we've eliminated grade 6. We now start foreign language in grade 7. So that's been an erosion of that program over time. This year we took 7 plus positions out of our preschool program by cutting a teacher and significantly reducing the aid support and consolidating the program at the Parker Road site. We're no longer using the Wesleyan Terrace site behind the post office. We cut our drama position at Oak. We eliminated a grade 2 and grade 4 health instruction over the last several years in order to meet budget requirements. This year we had eliminated 2 very successful positions at Sherwood and Oak, our advanced math coach positions that helped students who were ready to excel and take on more advanced math at the middle school level. We reduced over time a number of years ago our elementary media specialists. Now we have 1 media specialist for all the elementary schools. And we staff the media centers with paraprofessionals who do an excellent job. But we do not have a professional level position in each school as we did when I first came to Shrewsbury in the late 1990s. We eliminated media aid positions at the high school Oak and Sherwood over the last several years. We reduced our general instructional 8 hours at the elementary level by 60 hours, and those are key positions to support student learning. Our textbook and materials budget since FY17, that's continued to erode. It's down by 50%. That had been virtually dwindled to nothing before the override, and now that pattern's repeating itself. We also had a half-time position of we had a full-time position of a transportation safety and security coordinator that we cut by half this year, and all of our door monitors in order to meet the requirements of this year's budget. So from my perspective, I again want to thank Mr. Collins for his work on this 5-year projection. I would strongly suggest that it'll be important for the school committee to work in concert with the Board of Selectmen, with the Finance Committee, to look at developing a fiscal plan that will maintain the appropriate level of education that our community expects, and look to do that in a sustainable manner. We're in a situation where this has been predictable for a number of years. We've talked about this predictability. We've done numerous fiscal studies as a town. A few years back, we did another fiscal projection as a school district. Mr. Collins has extended that now at another 5 years. Mr. Mizikar, the town manager, is showing the same structural deficit based on the inability of the town as it's currently structured in terms of being able to raise enough revenue to cover the cost of services to provide to its citizens. Obviously, my responsibility is to advocate for the educational services provided to our youngest citizens. But obviously, we're all concerned, and certainly as a town resident myself, I'm also concerned about the ability of the town to maintain its other services to the community through its municipal government. So, our community is coming to a point of reckoning. This is a very significant challenge. It will be exacerbated by COVID. There is a possibility that we may get some additional relief from the federal government in the coming months, but we can't build a plan around that. And that would be a short-term help. But we also have a situation where not only do we have a very significant amount of funding that we would need to maintain what we have for next year, and on top of that, the estimate of upwards of $2 million to staff the opening of the new school, which we committed to as a community a few years ago. So unfortunately, there's no way to sugarcoat this. We're in a very difficult situation. And this is something that the entire community is going to have to work together to determine how we will be able to address it. And so with that, we'll turn it over to Ms. Fritz for any comments or questions from the committee.
Thank you, Dr. Suri, Mr. Collins. At this point, I'll open it up to the committee for questions and comments. And I can't see you yet. If Mr. Collins could take the presentation down. There we go. Dr. McGee. All right, you're on mute. Oh,
there's a lot in this presentation, and I appreciated every detail that is there. I think that very often people can be dizzied a little bit by details, and I just want to make a couple of very big points. One is that we have been and continue to cut services, and I think when a family sends their children to our schools, that they have every right to expect that the youngest child is going to get an education that is at least as good as the oldest child got. And yet at this point in time, we are not offering that. And I think that we are not meeting our obligations as leaders of this town in providing services to this community. That is a very important point. I think the second point I want to highlight is the fact that there were a lot of scenarios. There was the town scenario, there was our base scenario and our enhanced scenario. But we need to cut through that and understand one thing, and that is there is no scenario in which this town is going to break even with the current tax structure. Every scenario involves deficits. And so until we recognize the fact that we are faced with not only diminishing services, but also with a tax structure which at this point cannot support the services we're trying to provide, that we need to recognize that and address it urgently. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Lindsay.
I certainly, like Dr. McGee, think this is in some ways simple and yet very complex. And there's an awful lot of numbers here. So bear with me for a moment. Our community has gotten used to and expected great education at really low costs. We have really low overhead, but our cost structure to educate 6,000 children a year and continue in America running this program, costs continue to go up, and those are normal. You add on costs that are, significant dollars for the opening of Beale, or the things to get us back to essentially what is somewhat a little bit of a baseline, given the extraordinary decisions we had to make last fiscal year due to COVID and the concessions with our unions and as was already mentioned. But our revenue just doesn't keep up, doesn't come anywhere close. Notwithstanding that, we have significant fees on our community and our parent community. And we have significant fundraising by this district, the likes of which are really matched only by some of the largest cities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. As a way, packing a big punch there and trying to figure out other ways to meet those meet that deficit. And the impact in recent years alone are reduced programs that don't come back. In my family, my oldest child, Dr. McGee, he was the last year of second grade health. He was then the last year of fourth grade health. He was then the last year of sixth grade foreign language. And his younger sibling brings it up most nights that he's going to a meeting where I'm going to talk about the budget. He says, "You're going to get me a foreign language, Mom?" And so these things matter, and they matter to our kids and to our families. And fundamentally, as you mentioned, the degradation of services is not something that our town is set to expect. And they don't. They want more. They want more from us. The COVID issue is here, but this has really nothing to do with COVID. It has exacerbated our expenses. It has led to some increased dollars, but dollars that don't, because of how they are tied to reimbursements, that don't come anywhere close to the havoc that COVID has wreaked on our budget. And even new federal dollars. The ones that we're even thinking of right now are less than 10% of the difference that we have to make up here, right? They are just so small in comparison. So I don't want the community, and in many conversations I've been in, there's a lot of hoping that the federal government is going to save us. And I think that is not the right answer. It is not the right approach for where we are. Mr. Mezakar, our town manager's projection is based on our current revenue. And frankly, our current revenue just isn't enough as a town. And the way we deal with that, and the way we look at that reality, that our tax base in this community is one of the lowest that we have for similarly situated communities, and we deal with that by an override and an increase in our taxes. And as somebody whose job it is to advocate for our schools, I don't know how we can't start really making it clear to the community that's the answer here. It's really the only answer. Unless we're going to really, jack up our class sizes again to levels for which the community found completely intolerable back before our previous override, in a place that we have no reason to get to. There's room for this community to give more, and I think our community wants to give more. I think they're showing it over and over and over again when given the opportunity, and the rationales are explained, that this is a community that wants to see that and wants to see something better for our kids. So I hope that we can get together with the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee and the other members of the town administration to really start to have painful but very important conversations about how we're going to find our way out of this. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Wensky.
Yeah, now that you can see me. First off, I'd like to thank Mr. Collins for the presentation. As always, very detailed, very helpful, very challenging situation. Certainly this topic is not new to this school committee. nor should it be breaking news to any of the other boards in town. This is school budgeting 101 as far as it goes for Shrewsbury. This all predates COVID. COVID has, as we've said many times throughout the last 10 minutes, exacerbated the situation. But, we had to cut $1.9 million out of the budget prior to COVID hitting. And we've seen steady, slow erosion of the gains we had from the 2014 override. We just went through a list of reductions and eliminations of resources across every grade level. I think this is all a precursor to the next several months of budget season. We know budget season is a process. We know the numbers mature. Sometimes they get better, sometimes they get worse. So I think the question always is, how are we as a community going to solve this persistent, consistent financial problem that we just run into every year? But this year more than ever, because we got a lot of key things coming up, opening deal being one of them. And everything should be on the table for discussion, right? I mean, what are the tools in the tool belt to mitigate these financial challenges? One of them, yes, is an override. I know people cringe at that word, but it's a reality and we need to think about it, right? And my question has always been around this. I said this back in May. How do you know the answer to that question if you don't ask the question, right? So we need to have some really tough conversations. Because it's only going to get harder and harder as the years progress. This isn't just a one-year thing. We've said these projections, 5-year projections that were made in 2017 were 99% accurate. We had that information for the last 3 years. We've known about this. So it is a challenging topic, but again, I guess this is kickoff of our next budget season. So I look forward to the dialogue, and I encourage the public to email us, to reach out to us, and let us know how you would like us to approach, engagement around the solution. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Balich.
I want to thank Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins for the presentation. I also want to thank Ms. Fritz and Dr. McGee, who I know on our behalf have been engaging in an ongoing dialogue with other boards about this. And I know that has been very helpful and insightful, and I appreciate your work on that. It is difficult to think in the context of everything that's been going on the past few months. It's really difficult to think that we could have a more pressing problem than COVID. And certainly COVID is the most pressing at the moment because obviously there are considerations that impact the physical safety of staff and students, and obviously that comes first. But this problem predates COVID and will be here after COVID is gone. It is a problem we would have had whether COVID was with us at all or not. And so in the midst of everything else going on, it is almost astounding that we have to point to the fact that we have a looming crisis that is perhaps the single most substantial threat to the continued success of Shrewsbury Public Schools and to this district continuing to be what it has been for our community for so long. I have been on the school committee off and on since 2012. Most of my first term was pre-override. I came back on in 2017. It seems like this is a conversation I've been having in some form or other every time. I first got involved in Shrewsbury actually as a teenager. I met Mrs. Fritz in my teens working on early overrides, issues of school funding way back when. And you know what? That story isn't cute anymore because I'm in my 30s now. And it's like high time that the town was confronted with the fact that we have a structural problem that is not going to go away without a fairly substantial solution. I remember in the lead up to 2014 when we had to do real significant reduction, real significant harm to our educational program. And I remember, among other things I remember from that time is the shock and the hurt that families felt who had come to Shrewsbury for the quality of the schools and were surprised and taken aback. And there was a lot of some variant of the question of when did this happen? How did this happen? To anyone who's watching, and I do recognize here on January 6th, we're going to struggle for the community's attention tonight, but in the coming weeks, certainly for anyone watching this, the moment is now. The alarm bells are being sounded now. We do need residents to engage, whether you're a parent or whether you're just a resident who's concerned about the quality of public education in the district. This is a substantial situation that's going to start presenting problems in the immediate short term and is going to get worse as time goes on if it's not properly addressed. We need residents to engage. We are a very well-managed town. This is a really wonderful place to live. Our municipal government and our schools are both really well run. This is a really well-managed town. But this particular problem is not going to be solved by good management alone. It's going to require leadership. You cannot manage yourself out of a structural deficit this bad. The leadership of this community, including all of us, are going to have to make very difficult decisions in the months and years ahead. So for right now, I'm encouraging any residents who are hearing this and concerned to engage with any representative of municipal government that you can to express your concerns. We're going to need your involvement going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Collins for the work providing this projection. I think it's helpful to look at historical data, project out, and there is no good answer. It's just a deficit going forward. And I think the slide that really resonates with me, looking at what we need for our budget and then what the school department received. And it wasn't like we would ask for a large budget because we wanted all these items. It was really what we needed in order to provide educational services. We didn't get that, so we were able to try to nibble around the edges and provide services to students the best we could because we have such a strong group of educators and administrators that they are able to still provide what students need with less. And we do it every budget cycle. So it's a negative cycle and it continues and continues. And that negative cycle continues to catch up. And now we're in a position where it's just getting worse and worse. And what Mr. Wensky said, an override is a tool. It's one of the things that this district can use in order to provide additional revenue. Is it the right thing? I'm not sure. Is it something the community can afford? I'm not sure, but it's definitely something that we should look at as a community. And as Dr. Sawyer said, we all live here. We have a stake in this for our municipal services, for our school services. So it's something that I think as a community, we need to talk about. When we look at fees, we have some of the highest fees in the state. I don't think it's something that is sustainable for our families to continue to pay more fees. So there's so many things that we have to look at going forward. And again, it bears repeating, in March, we knew that this was going to be a difficult year for FY22. The noise of COVID kind of took over. So COVID compounded this, but it is not. FY22 was not caused by COVID. This was coming all along. So I think as we move forward, I do also agree with my committee members. We need to have early conversations with the Board of Selectmen, with the Finance Committee. We do need that, know that numbers need to mature as we move through the budget cycle. But this year, I think we need to have early conversations that are proactive because we need to plan. We may not know the numbers, but we need to plan and start talking about what we're going to do because it is a budget deficit no matter how we look at it. I don't think the federal or the state numbers are going to fix it. So I too would ask that as we move forward, we work with our fellow board members in the community and we start to look at what we're going to do because this is not something that's going to be solved easily. And it's something that we have to start looking at very seriously. So I want to thank again, Mr. Collins, Dr. Sawyer. We will be reaching out to our fellow board members and starting to try to get something done as we move forward. So thank you. Dr. Sawyer, anything further as we move ahead?
No, I think we've covered the subject thoroughly.
Great, thank you. Okay, next we're going to have another report from Mr. Collins. It is on the food services program for fiscal year 2021.
Okay, thank you. I have another presentation. Unfortunately, I am just not full of good news tonight. But as I alluded to at an earlier meeting, our food service operation has been suffering financially. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay. I did, as I said I would, I wanted to provide a more detailed update with respect to how we're operating our food service operation this year financially. Going to take a look at some overview data, some meals claims data to date, some potential adjustments, and then the potential impact on the general fund operating budget, which is kind of the key factor here, or a key factor here as well. Before I do that, I think, first of all, I just want to say a thanks to our food service staff who are, working diligently to provide nutritious meals to our students in a very difficult environment. Unfortunately, at the outset of the year, since we could foresee the enrollment drop with the hybrid model, that we did unfortunately have to lay off about a third of the staff at the beginning of the year. And then with the remainder of the staff, most of them, if not all of them, received reduced work hours. So that's how we began the year. And unfortunately, the situation has not gotten any better. And while the national government, the National School Lunch Program, has provided free meals for all students, what that basically means is that for every meal that is distributed to a student, we don't charge the student, of course, it's free to them. We make a claim, if you will, through our state Department of Education to get reimbursement for that. And that amount of money that's coming in for reimbursement is nowhere near covering our costs for staff and food. So let me just give a little bit more context here. This is just a 5-year look at how our program operates generally. This is, a so-called self-funding program in the past, where all the money's coming in for paid lunches and reimbursements for free and reduced lunches and a la carte sales. That's the blue bar. In the most recent time span, have exceeded our costs for labor and food costs. That's the red bar. So, we're about a $2 million program, just under, back in fiscal 17, went to 2.1 million in revenue in 18, 2.2 million in fiscal 19. And then, of course, in fiscal 20, last fiscal year, with the COVID closure, we had that precipitous drop off. And that was a losing year where our expenses, 1.8 million, exceeded our incoming revenues. And so what I've done is I've projected out into fiscal 21, what I think is the situation at hand, given the fact that we're about just a little bit more than a third of the school and through more than a third of the school year, excuse me. So I'm projecting costs to be at year end, under current conditions, total cost of $1.1 million projected, and $542,000 projected revenue. So large deficit. These, again, a different way to look at the same information for the same time span. Again, these are the operating results, gain or loss for each fiscal year. Fiscal 17 through 19 were positive years. Fiscal 20, we operated at a loss, and I'm projecting a loss this year of approximately $557,000. Just a little bit more detail on the revenue estimating. It's basically taking, the number of days that we're going to be having students in session this year. Right now, if there's no changes, would be 165. Of course, first 10 days, we did not have students in the buildings at the outset of the school year, and then post Christmas break, we've got 5 more days of closure. So we got 165 days where kids are coming in. And again, on Wednesdays, it's only cohort A. So September through November, you can see basically what the actuals have been for revenues coming in, and the average revenue daily, which has been increasing, thankfully. Again, as more students participated and took advantage of free meals, which is great. And so basically what I did is I took a $3,500 a day average going forward for December through June, and came up with revenue estimate of $542,000. The reimbursements that are provided per meal for breakfast, it's $2.62, and for lunch, it's $3.64. In case people were wondering about that, that's the monies that come in for each meal that is handed to a student. The remote meals count as well. So every time we hand out a remote meal, those count towards the meal claim as well. Again, of course, we know the reasons for plummeting revenues. On any given day, we have approximately 35% of the students in school, and we don't have any a la carte sales. Our kindergarten enrollment is down, not as many students enrolled there, and we have no adult meal sales. So just a significant drop off in all those various areas. The coronavirus relief grant that we received, the $1.39 million, specifically cannot be used to cover revenue losses. We've talked about this before, so that does not help us with this situation. And those monies will be fully expended on other COVID-related costs that the district has incurred. The Department of Ed did announce on December 11th a $5 million grant for school food service operations. Our allocation as a district was just over, well, it's $10,909. And so we're using that to offset the costs for grab and go packaging that we've had to purchase to provide those meals for students. So it helps, but it's certainly just kind of a pittance, if you will, in the context of the total overall operation. So future actions, unfortunately, again, we may potentially be looking at some further reduction of staff work hours, but we really can't cut too much more other than potentially on Wednesdays when we have many fewer students in the building. If we were to, for example, eliminate all of those hours between, say, the middle of January and the end of the school year, that would save us $38,000. But again, we're looking at a loss, annual operating loss in the range of $500,000. And I think that the key point here is that we can't end the year. The federal regulations for school lunch programs does not allow for the school lunch program to end the year in deficit. So we would have to cover the loss out of our general fund operating budget. That's part of the school lunch regulations. And so that's what's really pertinent, as this food service loss now becomes basically a negative impact on our operating budget and another cost to cover. So a message to parents and students: take the meals, take the free meals. All students are eligible for free meals, and obviously getting a nutritious breakfast or lunch, but by doing so, you're actually helping the district financially. Again, that's just kind of an urging to parents to take advantage of this free meals program for all the right reasons. I did want to just make mention too of our drive-through meal pickup program that continues Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to 11. It's been a consistent number of folks, anywhere between 20 and 30 cars per day are driving through to pick up meals. For those folks that can't meet those time frames, we have been and have a hardship, a transportation obstacle, and need the meals. We have been delivering meals, and certainly families can still continue to reach out to Food Service Director Beth Nichols at this email address or by telephone, and coordinate a delivery service if you can't make that. And your students are either in the hybrid or if they're remote students, they can certainly also participate in picking up these meals during these timeframes or receive delivery. With that, I'll stop sharing and be happy to answer any questions. But again, just kind of bringing it back to the beginning, I made mention earlier that this could become a financial problem for the district, and that I would provide more specific information. So that specific information to the committee is that if things don't change and our rates of participation stay about the same, and we don't get any other federal relief or other regulatory relief, then we're going to have to be looking at covering the cost of about $500,000, because we can't close that program in the red under current regulations.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments on that? Not seeing any. So this is something we'll just have to keep our eye on as we move through the rest of the year.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Dr. Sawyer, any comments or questions on this?
Well, I just want to thank certainly Mr. Collins for the report. I want to thank Beth Nichols, Director of Food Services, and her team of cafeteria managers and workers who have been doing their utmost best to create grab-and-go meals that are attractive to students. And of course, we feel terribly about the team members who we needed to lay off as a result of not having the fiscal ability to maintain their jobs. And obviously concerned that we may need to cut some hours back even further. It pains us to think about doing that. In terms of what this means, again, this is an example of in our previous presentation. Clearly, our issues with the budget overall were not related to COVID, but this is a COVID-related issue that is going to put more pressure on the budget, because having to cover this year's losses will reduce the ability to use any kind of savings that we possibly might experience this year, depending on how some of the stimulus works out. Of our regular dollars and move them forward to help us with next year, because we'll need to, under state law and regulation, cover this deficit. So it is another really significant and sobering challenge, and one that we don't have a whole lot of positive control over in terms of avoiding anything. If we have the good fortune of coming back into school fully in person at some point during the school year, obviously that will help, because they'll raise revenues back with students using the lunch program. But obviously we can't predict what that's going to look like at this point. So again, it's not a good news story, but we have to continue to focus on the realities we're facing and not sugarcoat the situation. And this is one that again is a difficulty for the school district.
Thank you again, Mr. Collins.
You're welcome.
Okay, next we have our minutes from the school committee workshop held on December 9th, 2020, and the school committee meeting held on December 16th, 2020. Are there any changes or corrections? I don't see any. Okay, those can be marked as accepted as distributed. We do need to go into an executive session this evening for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A7, to comply with or act under the authority of any general or special law or federal grant and aid requirements. Purpose 7, Open Meeting Law, Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 22FG, for the purpose of reviewing, approving, and/or releasing executive session minutes. And B, for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation if an open meeting may have a detrimental effect of the bargaining or litigating position of the public body. And the chair so declares. Purpose 3, the Shrewsbury Education Association's Units A and/or B, the Shrewsbury Paraprofessional Association and/or the Cafeteria Workers Association, where the deliberation in an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining position of the public body, and return to open session only for the purpose of adjourning for the evening. May I have a motion that we adjourn to executive session?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call vote is required. Dr. McGee?
Aye.
Mr. Palich?
Aye.
Ms. Heffernan?
Aye.
Mr. Wensky?
Aye.
Myself, aye. Motion, the meeting is adjourned. Good night.